The old community hall stood at the center of town like it had been there forever. Its brick walls had faded with time, and the wooden doors had been opened and closed by thousands of hands over the years. On most days, it stayed quiet except for small meetings, school events, or music classes. But on this cool evening, the place felt alive. Cars filled the parking lot. Families walked toward the entrance with warm drinks in their hands. Children ran ahead of their parents, laughing as they tried to race each other to the front steps. Older couples moved more slowly, smiling as they watched the excitement around them. Voices mixed together in the evening air, creating the kind of noise that only comes when people gather for something special. Tonight was the town's annual music showcase. It was one of those events people talked about for weeks. Every year, singers, musicians, students, teachers, and even a few brave beginners stepped onto the stage to perform. Some people came because they loved music. Some came because their children were performing. Others came simply because it had become tradition. Inside the hall, rows of seats were almost full. Soft yellow lights glowed from the walls, giving the room a warm and welcoming feeling. The stage at the front looked simple but beautiful. A black piano stood under a single spotlight, polished so well that it reflected the light like still water. Backstage, performers waited for their turn. Some quietly practiced their songs. Some stretched their fingers. Some whispered lyrics under their breath. Others walked back and forth, trying to calm their nerves. Near the back corner of the waiting area, away from most of the noise, someone sat alone on a wooden chair. A small music folder rested gently in her hands. She wasn't talking to anyone. She wasn't checking her phone. She wasn't warming up like the others. She simply sat there quietly, watching the floor as people moved around her. Her clothes were simple. Nothing flashy. Nothing designed to catch attention. Just a clean, neat outfit that made her blend into the crowd. Her hair was tied back in a way that looked more practical than stylish. If someone walked past her, they might not notice her at all. And most people didn't. Backstage volunteers rushed past carrying papers, water bottles, microphones, and clipboards. Teachers gave last-minute advice to nervous students. Parents peeked behind curtains to wave at their children. But she stayed in the same seat. Quiet. Still. Almost invisible. A volunteer holding a clipboard stopped near her. "Are you performing tonight?" She looked up slowly, almost surprised that someone had spoken to her. Then she gave a small nod. "Yes." The volunteer smiled politely. "I don't think I have your name on the list." She looked down at the folder in her lap, then back up. "I came late." "That's okay," the volunteer said kindly. "We still have a few open spots." The volunteer held out a pen. She reached for it carefully. Her fingers shook just a little. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough for her to feel it. She took the pen and looked at the paper in front of her. For a moment, she didn't write anything. Her eyes stayed fixed on the empty line. The volunteer waited patiently. Around them, backstage noise continued like nothing unusual was happening. Laughter, footsteps, music scales, curtains moving, applause from the audience after another performance. But for her, all of it seemed distant, as if the world around her had suddenly moved farther away. Her grip on the pen tightened slightly. Then, finally, she wrote her name. Slowly, carefully, as if each letter mattered. The volunteer looked at the form. "Piano?" She nodded. "Yes." The volunteer smiled again. "That's great. What will you be playing?" She opened her folder and looked at the sheet music inside. Her voice was soft. "One easy song." The volunteer glanced at the title and looked slightly surprised. It was a beginner piece, one of the simplest piano songs taught in local music classes, something children usually learned in their first year. The volunteer tried not to show surprise. "Oh, nice choice." She simply nodded. The volunteer moved on. But as soon as the clipboard disappeared into the crowd, two younger performers nearby exchanged curious looks. "Did you hear that?" one whispered. "She's playing that." The other quietly laughed. "Maybe she's teaching. Or maybe she's really nervous." They weren't trying to be cruel, just curious. But even whispers can travel farther than people realize. She heard every word. Still, She didn't react. She simply closed her folder and rested both hands on top of it. A few minutes later, another round of applause came from the stage. Someone finished singing. The host's cheerful voice echoed through the hall. What an amazing performance! The audience clapped loudly. Backstage, another performer got ready. And another. Time kept moving. One act after another. Songs. Guitar solos. A violin performance. A young child singing slightly off-key, while proud parents recorded every second. Laughter. Applause. More music. But in that small backstage corner, she remained quiet. Every now and then, she looked toward the curtain, toward the stage, toward the piano. Her breathing stayed slow, but her hands never fully stopped trembling. She placed them in her lap, then folded them together, then unfolded them again, as if she wasn't sure where to put them. Across the room, an older piano teacher noticed her sitting alone. The teacher had spent decades working with students, long enough to recognize nerves, long enough to recognize fear, and long enough to recognize something deeper than both. The teacher walked over. First time performing here? She looked up, then nodded once. Yes. The teacher smiled warmly. Well, everyone here remembers their first time. She tried to smile back. It barely appeared. The teacher sat in the empty chair beside her. You look calm. She stared at the floor for a moment. I'm not. The teacher gave a soft laugh. Good. Calm performers are boring. That earned the smallest real smile. Only for a second. But it was there. The teacher noticed. That piano out there, the teacher said quietly, looking toward the stage. It doesn't care who sits at it. She looked up. What do you mean? The teacher smiled. It doesn't care if you're famous. It doesn't care if you're young. It doesn't care if you're scared. It only asks one thing. She listened carefully. What? The teacher looked at her hands. Honesty. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then applause broke out again from the audience. Another performer had finished. The teacher stood. You'll do fine. Then the teacher walked away. She sat there silently, thinking about those words. Honesty. Her fingers slowly touched the edge of the music folder. She opened it again. The sheet music inside looked worn. Not new. Not clean. The edges were slightly folded. The paper carried signs of being opened and closed many times. She ran her fingers across the notes. Softly. Almost like greeting an old friend. Then she closed her eyes. And for just a moment, everything around her disappeared. The noise. The people. The laughter. The applause. Even the stage. All of it faded. And in its place came memories. A small room. Sunlight through old curtains. A piano with faded keys. Laughter. Warm voices. Hands guiding her fingers. Music. Then silence. Her eyes opened quickly. She took a slow breath and looked toward the stage again. A volunteer suddenly appeared near the curtain. 5 minutes. Her heart skipped. She nodded. The volunteer moved on. 5 minutes. The words stayed in her mind. 5 minutes. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling more now. She pressed them together tightly, then loosened them, then tightened them again. Across the hall, another round of applause exploded. The host stepped back onto the stage. The audience cheered. More names. More performances. And then, the clipboard volunteer appeared again. This time with a smile. You're next. The words hit harder than she expected. For 1 second, it felt like the room tilted. Her throat tightened. Her legs suddenly felt heavier. But she stood, slowly, carefully, holding the music folder close to her chest. The backstage lights felt brighter now. The sounds louder. Every step toward the curtain felt heavier than the last. People moved aside as she passed. Some smiled politely. Some barely noticed. Some looked curious. And a few looked confused. She stopped just behind the curtain. Only a few feet away from the stage. Only a few feet away from the piano. She could hear the audience clearly now. Hundreds of voices. Hundreds of expectations. Hundreds of strangers. The host's voice filled the hall once more. And now, A pause. A shuffle of papers. Then her name. For a moment, she didn't move. The volunteer gently touched her shoulder. It's time. She looked at the stage, at the light, at the piano, then took one slow breath and stepped forward. The bright stage lights touched her face the moment she stepped out from behind the curtain. For a second, everything felt unreal. The applause from the previous performance was still fading, and hundreds of eyes slowly turned toward her. Some people smiled politely. Some looked down at the program in their hands. Some whispered quietly to the person sitting beside them. She could feel every single look, even from people sitting in the back rows. Her heart pounded so hard that for a moment she wondered if the microphone near the piano could somehow pick it up. But she kept walking. One step, then another, then another. The polished wooden stage felt strange under her shoes, almost like she was walking somewhere she had once known but had stayed away from for far too long. The piano stood under the spotlight, quiet and waiting. She stopped beside it. For just a moment, she looked at it without moving. The audience probably thought she was nervous. And they were right. But this wasn't the kind of nervousness most performers felt before a show. This was older, deeper, heavier. This was the kind of fear that had been building quietly for years. She placed her music folder gently on the piano. Then she looked out at the crowd. Rows and rows of faces. Children, parents, teachers, students, neighbors, strangers. And somewhere in that crowd, people who had no idea that simply standing on the stage had already taken more courage than anything she had done in years. She sat down slowly on the piano bench. The wood felt cool beneath her. Her fingers rested in her lap. Still trembling, she kept her eyes on the keys. White, black, white, black. So familiar, and yet somehow so distant. Her breathing became shallow. The room around her suddenly felt bigger. Too big. She closed her eyes. And, without warning, the present disappeared. Her mind traveled back. Back to a much smaller room. Back to a different piano. Back to another life. It had been years ago, in a small house near the edge of town. Nothing fancy. Just a warm home filled with everyday sounds. Morning tea. Open windows. Birds outside. Soft laughter. And music. There had always been music. Sometimes from an old radio. Sometimes from humming in the kitchen. And most often, from the piano. It wasn't a beautiful piano. Not expensive. Not polished. Some of the keys had faded. A few had tiny scratches. The bench made a quiet creaking sound whenever someone sat on it. But none of that mattered. Because to her, it had felt magical. She still remembered the first time her fingers touched those keys. She had been small. Her feet barely reached the floor. Her hands were tiny. And every note had felt like discovering a new world. At first, the sounds were uneven. Clumsy. Sometimes funny. Sometimes wrong. But no one laughed. Not once. Instead, there were smiles. Encouraging words. Patient hands guiding hers. Warm voices saying things like, "Try again. You're getting better. Listen to the music. Feel it." And little by little, she did. Day after day, she practiced. Before school. After school. Late in the evening. Sometimes until the sunlight disappeared from the windows. She didn't practice because someone forced her. She practiced because she loved it. Music didn't feel like work. It felt like home. By the time she was older, people around town had started noticing. Teachers praised her. Neighbors asked her to play during gatherings. Family friends smiled proudly whenever she touched the piano. And every time she played, she smiled. Real smiles. The kind that come naturally. The kind you don't have to think about. The kind that make your eyes shine. Back then, life felt simple. Safe. Predictable. Like nothing could break it. But life doesn't always ask for permission before it changes. She remembered that day more clearly than she wanted to. It had started like any other. Sunlight through the kitchen window. Breakfast on the table. Soft music playing somewhere in the house. Normal voices. Normal laughter. Normal plans. Nothing felt different. Nothing felt wrong. And maybe that was what made it hurt even more. Because sometimes the hardest moments begin on the most ordinary days. One phone call, one sudden silence, one expression on someone's face, and everything changed. Completely. The warmth in that house disappeared. The music stopped. The laughter stopped. Even the air felt different. Heavier. Colder. The days that followed became blurry. Visitors. Quiet voices. Tears. Long silences. Closed curtains. Unfinished meals. And a pain so deep she didn't know how to talk about it. People tried. They sat beside her. They offered comfort. They told her time would help. They told her to stay strong. They told her healing would come. But none of those words seemed to reach her. Because the one place she had always gone when life felt confusing, the piano, now felt impossible to touch. At first, she thought it would only be for a few days, then a few weeks, then a few months. But weeks became seasons. Seasons became years. And the piano stayed silent. At first, people kept asking, "Will you play again? Do you miss it? Have you practiced lately?" She always smiled politely, always gave short answers, always changed the subject. And eventually, people stopped asking. Life moved on. Friends moved away. Children grew up. The town changed. Faces changed. Buildings changed. Even the old music teachers retired. And through all of it, the piano remained untouched. Dust slowly gathered on the keys. Music books stayed closed. And the part of her that once felt alive through music grew quieter. Not gone, just buried. Buried under memories. Buried under pain. Buried under years of silence. Until one afternoon, not long before tonight, she had walked past the old room where that piano still stood. She wasn't looking for anything. She had simply been passing by. But the door had been slightly open. And through that small opening, she saw it. The same piano. Waiting. Silent. Patient. As if no time had passed at all. She should have kept walking. And for a moment, she almost did. But something made her stop. She stood there for a long time. Just staring. Her heart beating faster. Her hands cold. Her mind filled with memories. And then, without thinking too much, she stepped inside. Slowly. Quietly. The room smelled exactly the same. Old wood. Paper. Sunlight. Time. She walked toward the piano. Every step felt heavier than the last. When she finally sat down, the bench made the same tiny creaking sound she remembered from childhood. And somehow, that sound nearly broke her. Her hands hovered above the keys. Not touching, just hovering. Her breathing became uneven. Her vision blurred. Tears she thought were long gone returned without warning. She almost stood up, almost walked away, almost closed the door forever. But instead, she lowered one finger and touched a single key. One note. Soft. Fragile. Beautiful. And in that one tiny sound, something inside her moved. Not healed. Not fixed. But awakened. She played another note. Then another. Then another. Simple. Slow. Careful. Like learning how to breathe again. And for the first time in years, the silence inside her began to crack. Now, back on the stage, sitting in front of hundreds of strangers, she opened her eyes. The memories faded. The crowd returned. The lights returned. The piano in front of her returned. Her hands still trembled. But something inside her felt different now. Not fearless. Not fully ready. But no longer running. She looked down at the keys. Then placed both hands gently above them. The audience waited. The hall became quieter. One whisper. Then another. Then none. Even the children seemed still. She took one slow breath. And for the first time in years, she was ready to touch the music again. The hall had grown so quiet that even the smallest sound felt louder than usual. A chair moving in the back row. Someone clearing their throat. The soft rustle of paper as a few people looked down at the event program in their hands. She sat at the piano without moving. Her fingers hovered above the keys. Her breathing was slow but uneven. From the audience, she probably looked calm, maybe even confident. But inside, Her heart was beating hard enough to shake every thought in her mind. She stared at the keys as if they might suddenly feel unfamiliar. White, black, white, black. So simple, so ordinary. And yet, at this moment, they felt heavier than anything she had ever touched. In the front rows, a few children leaned toward their parents and whispered. Some people looked at the stage. Some looked at the program. And some noticed the title of the song she had chosen. It was a piece almost everyone who studied piano recognized. A beginner song. One of the first melodies many students learned. Short. Simple. Easy. A few quiet reactions moved through the crowd. That's her song. That's it. Maybe she's just starting. Maybe she's teaching. One older man adjusted his glasses and looked down at the program again, thinking he had read it wrong. A teenage piano student sitting beside her mother quietly smiled. I learned that when I was 8. Her mother nodded. Maybe she's nervous. A few rows behind them, someone checked their phone. Near the back, 2 friends leaned closer to each other. This should be quick. Neither of them meant any harm. They were simply expecting something ordinary. Something small. Something forgettable. And, honestly, so was almost everyone else. Backstage, the older piano teacher stood near the curtain, watching silently. No smile. No words. Just quiet attention. As if the teacher understood that what was happening on that stage had very little to do with music. And everything to do with courage. At the piano, she slowly lifted her wrists. Her fingers lowered closer to the keys. Then stopped. Her chest rose. Then fell. She closed her eyes. Just for a moment. One breath. Then another. The silence in the room grew deeper. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was expectant. The kind of silence that appears right before something begins. She opened her eyes. And gently, very gently, her finger touched the first key. One note. Soft. Clear. Beautiful. The sound floated into the hall like a single drop of rain on still water. Then another note followed. And another. And another. Simple. Slow. Careful. The melody began exactly as everyone expected. Easy. Basic. Familiar. Predictable. A few audience members smiled politely. Some relaxed in their seats. Some continued looking at the printed program. A few people still seemed distracted. One man near the back quietly glanced at his phone again. A little child in the second row swung her feet under her chair. Nothing unusual. Nothing dramatic. Just a simple song. Exactly what everyone had expected. But at the piano, something else was happening. Her fingers still shook slightly. Not enough to miss the notes. Just enough to show that every movement carried weight. She played carefully, as if each key mattered. As if every note carried a memory. As if this simple song wasn't simple at all. The first few measures passed quietly. Softly. Without mistakes. Without showmanship. Without anything flashy. Just honest music. And slowly, very slowly, something in her posture began to change. Her shoulders, which had been tense from the moment she walked on stage, started to relax. Her breathing became steadier. Her hands moved more naturally, less like someone forcing herself to perform, more like someone remembering who she used to be. The audience didn't fully notice it at first, but they felt it, even if they couldn't explain why. The teenage piano student in the front row stopped whispering. The man checking his phone looked up. The little child stopped swinging her feet. Somewhere near the middle rows, a woman folded the event program and placed it in her lap. No one said anything. But the room was changing, and the music, though still simple, was changing with it. Each note seemed warmer now, more alive, more personal. She wasn't just pressing keys. She was telling something. Something without words. Something older than the song itself. At the piano, her eyes stayed on the keys. But in her mind, she was somewhere else. Not in the hall. Not under the spotlight. Not in front of strangers. She was back in that old room, back with the faded piano, back with sunlight through thin curtains, back when music felt like breathing. Her fingers remembered movements her mind had nearly forgotten. Small turns, Soft transitions, tiny pauses, subtle touches, nothing difficult, nothing complicated, and yet every movement carried meaning. The older piano teacher near the curtain noticed it immediately. The teacher's expression softened. Then slowly, the teacher smiled. Because this wasn't someone playing a beginner song. This was someone finding her way home. On stage, the melody continued. Still simple, still familiar, still quiet. But now, no one in the audience seemed distracted anymore. The hall had grown completely still. No whispering, no phones, no rustling paper. Even the children were watching. And then something happened that she hadn't expected. Her fear began to fade. Not all at once. Not like magic. But little by little. Note by note. Breath by breath. Her fingers stopped trembling. Her wrists loosened. Her movements became smoother. More confident. More natural. And for the first time since sitting down, she forgot about the crowd. She forgot about the lights. She forgot about the hundreds of eyes. She forgot about being watched. There was only the piano. Only the music. Only the story inside the notes. A man in the third row leaned forward slightly. An elderly woman near the aisle placed her hand gently over her heart. A young boy who had spent most of the evening looking bored suddenly sat up straighter. Nobody knew exactly why. The song hadn't become faster. It hadn't become louder. It hadn't become more difficult. It was still the same easy melody. And yet, it no longer felt ordinary. Because people were no longer hearing just music. They were hearing truth. And truth doesn't need complexity. It doesn't need speed. It doesn't need perfection. It only needs honesty. She remembered the teacher's words backstage. The piano only asks one thing: honesty. And now, without even realizing it, she was giving exactly that. Halfway through the song, her expression changed. The fear in her face softened. The tension in her jaw disappeared. And for the first time that night, a small smile appeared. Not for the audience. Not for the cameras. Not for applause. Just for herself. Just for the girl who had once spent endless afternoons at an old piano. Just for the years she thought were lost. The audience noticed. And somehow, that tiny smile made the room even quieter. Because everyone could feel it. This wasn't about performance anymore. This wasn't about talent. This wasn't even about music. This was about someone healing right in front of them. And nobody wanted to miss a second of it. Near the back of the hall, one of the volunteers slowly lowered the clipboard in her hands. She had stopped working. Stopped moving. Stopped thinking about schedules and performer lists. Because like everyone else, she was listening. Completely. On stage, her fingers moved through another section of the melody. Soft. Gentle. Certain. And now, the simple song had become something no one had expected. Not because it was technically brilliant. Not because it was difficult. But because every note felt real. And real things are impossible to ignore. She reached the final part of the song. Only a few measures remained. But no one in the room seemed ready for it to end. Not the children. Not the parents. Not the teachers. Not the strangers. Not even her. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't just playing music. She was living inside it. And as her fingers moved toward the next notes, someone in the back row quietly whispered words that somehow captured what everyone else was feeling. Who is she? The whisper came from somewhere near the back of the hall. Who is she? The words were soft, barely louder than a breath. And yet somehow, they carried through the silence, like another note in the music. No one answered. Not because nobody knew, but because nobody wanted to break what was happening. Every eye remained fixed on the stage. Every face pointed toward the piano. Every breath in the room seemed slower now. She didn't hear the whisper. Or maybe she did. At this point, it didn't matter. Because she was no longer thinking about the audience. She was no longer thinking about the lights. She was no longer thinking about the fear that had nearly stopped her from walking onto the stage. She was only thinking about the music. Her fingers moved across the keys with quiet confidence. Not fast. Not dramatic. Not flashy. Just honest. Simple notes. Simple timing. Simple melody. And yet every note seemed to reach deeper than anyone expected. The little girl sitting in the second row leaned forward so far that her mother gently placed a hand on her shoulder. But even then, the child didn't look away. An elderly man near the front had folded both hands together in his lap. His eyes never left the stage. A group of teenagers who had spent most of the evening quietly joking with each other were now completely still. Even the volunteers near the side walls had stopped moving. No one wanted to interrupt the moment. On stage, her fingers moved through another part of the song. And with every note, another memory rose inside her. She could almost smell the old wood of that small room from years ago. She could almost hear the soft creaking of the piano bench. She could almost feel sunlight on her shoulders from afternoons that seemed so far away now. For years, those memories had hurt. For years, they had felt too heavy to touch, too sharp, too painful, too full of things she had lost. But tonight, something was changing. The memories were still there. The pain was still there. But it no longer felt like something chasing her. It felt like something walking beside her. Quiet, gentle, no longer asking to be hidden. She pressed another key, then another, and another. Her hands moved naturally now, like they remembered something her heart had almost forgotten. Backstage, the older piano teacher remained near the curtain, watching, listening, understanding. The teacher had seen thousands of performances over the years. Brilliant students, talented musicians, competitions, concerts, standing ovations, mistakes, breakthroughs. But this was different. Because talent could impress people, skill could amaze people, but honesty could move people. And right now, that was exactly what was happening. In the audience, a woman sitting near the middle rows quietly reached into her purse for a tissue. She didn't fully understand why her eyes had filled with tears. The song wasn't sad. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even complicated. And yet, something about it felt personal. Something about it felt familiar. As if every person in the room was hearing their own story inside those simple notes. A father sitting beside his young son gently placed his arm around the boy's shoulder. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. At the piano, her breathing remained calm, steady, natural. The shaking in her hands was completely gone now. Her shoulders were relaxed. Her movements were smooth. And for the first time that night, she wasn't just surviving the performance. She was enjoying it. A small smile touched her face again. This time longer. This time real. The kind of smile that begins quietly and grows without permission. And when people in the audience saw it, something changed again. Because until now, they had been watching a performer. But now, they were watching someone come back to life. The melody continued. Soft. Clear. Beautiful. The notes filled every corner of the hall, bounced off the wooden walls, floated above the rows of chairs, wrapped around every person in the room. And somehow, even though the song was one almost everyone recognized, it no longer sounded familiar. Because she wasn't playing it the way it had been written. Not exactly. She wasn't changing the notes. She wasn't changing the rhythm. She wasn't making it harder. She was simply giving it something most people forget to bring. Meaning. Every pause felt intentional. Every breath felt connected. Every note felt alive. Near the back row, the two friends who had quietly said, "This should be quick," sat with completely different expressions now. Neither of them looked at each other. Neither of them looked at their phones. Neither of them whispered. One of them slowly shook his head in disbelief. Not because the song was difficult, but because something so simple had somehow become unforgettable. The teenage piano student in the front row stared at the stage with wide eyes. She had practiced this same song years ago. She knew every note, every measure, every turn, and yet, she had never heard it like this. She leaned closer to her mother and whispered softly, "It sounds different." Her mother kept her eyes on the stage, then quietly answered, "No." A small pause. Then, "It sounds real." On stage, her fingers reached the next section. Only a few pages remained. Only a few minutes left. But time no longer felt normal. The room felt suspended. As if nobody wanted the moment to move forward. as if nobody wanted the final note to arrive. She looked down at the keys, and, for a brief second, her eyes blurred. Not from fear, not from stage lights, but from emotion. Memories came rushing back again. The small room, the old piano, the voices, the laughter, the warmth, and the silence that followed. For one dangerous moment, her chest tightened. Her fingers hesitated, just slightly, so small that most people wouldn't notice. But the older piano teacher noticed, and held her breath, because sometimes healing doesn't move in straight lines. Sometimes old pain returns when you least expect it. Sometimes the hardest part isn't beginning. Sometimes it's continuing. Her fingers paused above the keys. A fraction of a second. Long enough to feel the weight of everything. The loss. The years. The silence. The fear. The memories. The empty rooms. The untouched piano. The days she almost forgot who she used to be. All of it. Right there.
Right now.
One breath. Then another. Her eyes closed. Just for a moment. And, in that quiet darkness, she heard something. Not with her ears. With her memory. A voice from long ago.
Warm.
Patient. Gentle. The same voice that once sat beside her at the old piano. The same voice that used to smile and say, again. Her eyes opened, and something inside her became stronger. Not louder. Not harder. Stronger. She lowered her hands and played the next note. Then the next. Then the next. Without fear. Without hesitation. Without looking back. The audience felt it immediately, even if they couldn't explain how. Something had shifted. The music had become deeper, warmer, more powerful. And now, tears were no longer hidden. The woman with the tissue quietly wiped her eyes. The elderly man in the front row blinked slowly. A volunteer near the wall pressed her hand gently over her mouth. And somewhere near the back, someone quietly whispered, "Oh my," not because they were watching a performance, but because they were witnessing something far more rare. Someone healing. Someone remembering. Someone becoming whole in front of strangers. And as the final section of the song drew closer, the hall remained completely silent. Not a single cough. Not a single whisper. Not a single moving chair. Only music. Only truth. Only one easy song. Becoming something nobody would ever forget. The final section of the song had begun, but nobody in the hall seemed ready for it to end. Not the children in the front rows. Not the parents holding their phones without recording anymore. Not the volunteers standing quietly near the walls. Not the teachers. Not the students. Not even the people who had walked into the hall expecting nothing more than another ordinary community performance. Every face remained turned toward the stage. Every eye stayed fixed on the piano. And every person in that room seemed to understand something without needing words. This was no longer about music. This was about something much deeper. She sat at the piano with her hands moving gently across the keys, her fingers now calm, steady, and full of quiet confidence. The fear that had followed her backstage. The shaking hands. The heavy breathing. The tightness in her chest. All of it seemed far away now. Not gone. Just no longer in control. The music had taken its place. And with every note, she seemed to become more like the person she had once been. Maybe even stronger. The melody moved softly through the hall.
Warm. Simple. Honest.
Every note landed exactly where it needed to. No extra movement. No dramatic expressions. No performance tricks. Just truth. And somehow, that truth had reached everyone. In the third row, a woman who had come only to watch her nephew perform quietly held a tissue in both hands. She wasn't crying loudly. There were no dramatic tears. Just quiet emotion she didn't fully understand. Beside her, her husband leaned forward with both elbows on his knees, staring at the stage as if he didn't want to blink. A young boy who had spent half the evening asking when they could leave now sat completely still, his eyes wide. Even the teenage piano student in the front row looked different now. The confident smile she had worn earlier, the one that came from recognizing an easy song, was gone. In its place was respect. Real respect. Because somewhere during this simple melody, she had realized something important. Playing the right notes wasn't the same as making people feel something. And tonight, this woman on stage was making an entire room feel everything. Backstage, the older piano teacher kept both hands folded in front, eyes locked on the stage. There was pride in that expression. But there was something else too. Recognition. Because teachers spend years helping students learn music. But every now and then, they get to witness something beyond technique. Something beyond lessons. Something beyond practice. Tonight was one of those moments. On stage, she moved into the final lines of the melody. Only a few measures remained. She knew it. The audience didn't. But somehow they felt it. A quiet tension moved through the room. Not fear. Not nervousness. Something closer to sadness. The kind of sadness people feel when they know something beautiful is about to end. Her fingers moved with complete control now. Every touch on the keys felt natural. As if the years between then and now had slowly disappeared. As if she had never left the piano at all. And yet, inside her, emotions were rising stronger than ever. Because the closer she came to the final note, the more memories returned. The old room, the faded keys, the sunlight, the laughter, the voices, the warmth, and then, the silence. But this time, the silence no longer felt like pain. For the first time in years, it felt like peace. Her eyes became slightly wet. Not enough for the audience to notice, but enough for her to feel. She kept playing. Because now she understood something she hadn't understood before. Healing didn't mean forgetting. Healing didn't mean pretending nothing happened. Healing meant remembering, without breaking. And right now, she was remembering everything, and still moving forward. In the audience, a man near the back quietly removed his glasses and wiped his eyes before putting them back on. Beside him, his teenage daughter noticed but said nothing. She simply reached over and gently held his hand. Neither of them looked away from the stage. Near the center rows, the volunteer with the clipboard, the same one who had looked surprised when she saw the beginner song, stood frozen. Clipboard hanging at her side. Work forgotten. Schedule forgotten. Everything forgotten. Because this wasn't something you organized. This wasn't something you timed. This was something you felt. And every person in that hall was feeling it. On stage, her fingers reached the second-to-last line. The hall became even quieter. If someone had dropped a coin, everyone would have heard it. No whispers. No phones. No movement. Only music. Only breath. Only truth. Her fingers touched the next note softly. One. Then another. Then another. The melody rose gently, then settled, like a story coming home. She looked down at the keys. And for one brief second, she smiled. Not the nervous smile from backstage. Not the careful smile from earlier. A real smile. A peaceful smile. A smile that carried years of pain and years of strength. A smile that said, "I made it." The older piano teacher saw it first and quietly closed her eyes for a moment, as if offering silent gratitude. Because sometimes, watching someone find themselves again can feel like a gift. On stage, only 3 notes remained. The audience didn't know, but somehow, everyone seemed to lean forward at the same time. The little girl in the second row held her mother's hand tighter. The teenage student sat perfectly still. The elderly man near the front didn't blink. And somewhere near the back, someone quietly whispered, "Please don't end." She never heard it, because now, there was only the piano, only the music, only the final steps of a journey she thought she might never finish. Her fingers touched the third-to-last note. Soft. Clear. Beautiful. Then the second-to-last. Warm. Gentle. Honest. And finally, she pressed the last key. One final note. Simple. Pure. And then, silence. The note floated through the hall, touched the walls, touched the ceiling, touched every heart in that room. And slowly, very slowly, it disappeared. She kept her hands on the keys. She didn't move. She didn't look up. She simply sat there, breathing, feeling, listening. The audience remained silent, not because they didn't know what to do, but because nobody wanted to break the moment. A second passed, then another, and still, no one moved. It was the deepest silence the old community hall had ever known. And in that silence, something happened. The host, standing quietly near the side of the stage, looked down at a folded note in his hand. A note someone had given him earlier that evening. He had planned to read it before her performance. But somehow, it hadn't felt right. Now,
It did.
he took one slow step toward the microphone. But still, no applause, no cheering, only silence. The host looked out at the audience, then toward her, then back at the crowd. His voice, when it finally came, was soft, almost emotional. There's something, he paused, swallowed hard, then continued. There's something all of you should know. And for the first time since the music ended, she slowly lifted her eyes. For a moment, she looked almost surprised to still be sitting there, as if the music had carried her so far away that she had forgotten where she was. The bright stage lights returned. The faces in the audience returned. The old community hall returned. And so did the silence. Hundreds of people sat completely still, watching her. No one clapped. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe too loudly. The final note had disappeared, but somehow the music still felt present, floating somewhere in the room. She gently removed her hands from the keys. Her fingers rested in her lap. They were no longer shaking, not even a little. At the side of the stage, the host stood near the microphone, holding a folded piece of paper in one hand. His expression was different now, less like an event host, more like someone who had just witnessed something personal. He looked at the audience, then back at her, then slowly brought the microphone closer. There's something all of you should know. His voice was soft, not theatrical, not dramatic, just honest. The audience remained silent. Even the children stayed still. The host unfolded the small piece of paper in his hand. He looked down at it for a moment before speaking again. This note was given to me earlier tonight. He paused. And I wasn't sure if I should read it. He looked toward her again. She sat quietly at the piano listening. Her breathing was calm. Her eyes were still slightly wet. But there was no fear left in her face now. Only quiet curiosity. The host continued. I asked permission before stepping onto the stage. He smiled gently. And I was told, if the moment felt right, I could share it. He looked back at the crowd. The hall remained completely silent. Then he began reading. She hasn't performed in public for many years. A quiet murmur moved through the audience, then quickly disappeared. The host continued. Not because she stopped loving music. He paused. But because life placed pain in places where music once lived. No one moved. No one whispered. No one looked away. The words seemed to land just as deeply as the music had. The host looked down again. His voice became softer. Tonight is not just a performance. He swallowed. Then read the next line. Tonight is the first time she has touched a public piano since the day her world changed. The room grew even quieter, if that was even possible. Some people lowered their eyes. Some pressed their lips together. Some blinked away tears. And on stage, she sat completely still. Her eyes remained on the floor for a moment. Not from shame, not from sadness, but from the weight of hearing her own journey spoken out loud. For years, she had carried it quietly, hidden, private, untouched. And now, without details, without explanations, without telling every painful part, the truth had finally been shared. The host folded the paper slowly, then looked directly at the audience. She didn't come here tonight to impress anyone. He paused. She came here to find something she thought she had lost. A woman near the middle rows quietly covered her mouth. The elderly man in the front row removed his glasses again. The teenage piano student lowered her eyes for a moment, as if thinking about every practice session she had ever complained about. The volunteer with the clipboard pressed both hands against her chest. And then, for one long second, nothing happened. Only silence. Only emotion. only understanding. She looked up from the piano bench, slowly,
Carefully.
and for the first time since the performance ended, she looked directly at the audience. What she saw nearly took her breath away. No one looked distracted. No one looked bored. No one looked impressed by skill. They looked moved, deeply moved. And then, one sound broke the silence. A single clap,
Soft. Steady.
from the elderly man in the front row.
Once. Twice.
3 times. Then another person joined. Then another. Then another. And suddenly, the entire hall erupted. Applause filled every corner of the room.
Loud.
Powerful. Endless. People rose from their seats. First a few. Then dozens. Then all of them. A full standing ovation. Children. Parents.
Teachers.
Students. Strangers. Every single person. She stared at them in complete disbelief. Her eyes widened. Her lips parted slightly. And for a second, she looked like she didn't know what to do. Because she hadn't expected this. She hadn't come for applause. She hadn't come for recognition. She hadn't come to be seen. She had only come to play one easy song. And now, an entire room stood for her. The applause kept growing. Louder. Longer.
Stronger.
Some people wiped away tears while clapping. Others smiled through wet eyes. A few simply stood there shaking their heads in quiet disbelief. Backstage, the older piano teacher smiled with tears in her own eyes. Not because someone had played perfectly, but because someone had come back. And sometimes, that matters more than perfection ever will. On stage, she slowly stood from the piano bench. Her legs felt weak. Not from fear, from emotion. She placed one hand gently on the piano for balance, then looked out at the crowd again. And finally, she smiled. Not the small nervous smile from earlier. Not the careful smile during the song. This was different. This was full. This was peaceful. This was the smile of someone who had carried darkness for years and had finally found light again. The applause continued. She placed one hand over her heart, then gave a small nod, a silent thank you, and somehow, that simple gesture made people clap even harder. The host quietly stepped back, allowing the moment to belong completely to her. Because everyone understood now. This wasn't just a music performance. This wasn't just a community event. This was a turning point, a beginning. After what felt like forever, the applause slowly began to settle. People returned to their seats. Though many kept wiping their eyes, many kept smiling. Many kept looking at the stage as if they had just witnessed something they would tell people about for years. She gently closed her music folder. The same old folder she had held backstage with trembling hands. But now, her hands were steady, completely steady. She looked at the piano one last time, ran her fingers softly across the edge of the keys. And in that quiet moment, she understood something. She hadn't come back to music. Music had been waiting for her all along. She simply needed the courage to return. As she began walking toward the curtain, the audience started clapping again. Softly this time, warmly, like saying goodbye to someone they somehow felt connected to. Halfway to the curtain, she stopped, turned back, looked at the piano once more, and smiled. Because for the first time in years, it no longer reminded her of loss. It reminded her of home. Weeks later, people in town would still talk about that night. Parents would tell their children about it. Students would remember it during difficult practice sessions. Teachers would mention it during lessons. And those who had been in that hall would always remember one simple truth. She stepped on stage to play one easy song. But what followed, no one would ever forget.